we know these words from our childhood, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, when Jefferson wrote this, and when the founding fathers who led the War of Secession from Great Britain, when's the last time your public school teacher referred to it as that, the War of Secession from Great Britain, which of course is what it was, they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors. If they had lost the War of Secession, which we call the American Revolution, they would have been hanged as traitors, but they won, and they are celebrated as founding fathers. But when they signed this document, knowing what it said, in those days they read things before they voted for them and signed them. Unlike today, they were wedding to the United States of America at its birth the concept of the natural law. And the simple modern articulation of that is this: our rights come from our humanity and not from the government. And that articulation formed the basis, at least in theory, of the War of Secession against Great Britain and of the earliest parts of our existence as a country. Now, whether you believe that we are the highest and best creatures of nature, or whether you believe, as I do, that we were created by an all-knowing, all-loving God who has counted the hairs on our heads, in either case, you can accept the argument that we are sovereign human beings. If we are the highest form of nature at this point in the history of existence, we are sovereign human beings. And because we are sovereign human beings and the government is a temporary organization based on fire and force, the individual is greater than the government. We are free to do as we wish because that is the essence of our existence. So if the government tries to exalt itself above that freedom, it's not only getting in our face in a way we don't like, it's violating the laws of nature. Because whether you call it nature or him, God the Father, nature and God are superior to the government, and they have created us with this freedom. In 1787, when the Constitution was being written in secret in Philadelphia, the scrivener was James Madison. He kept the notes. We've since seen the notes. Many of his notes were eventually engrafted into the language of the Constitution. The first argument we know from his notes was, where does our freedom come from? Now, Madison said this is not an argument that we should engage in. Do you remember what many of us signed 14 years ago? It was the Declaration of Independence. We already stated where our freedom comes from. Well, the world was different then. The king was gone. The British troops were gone. They'd come back in the War of 1812, but at the time in 1787, they were gone. So this argument did exist in secret in Philadelphia. Madison made the Jeffersonian argument. I know Jefferson wasn't there. He was still the U.S. ambassador to France. He was in Paris at the time. But his argument was, much as Jefferson made, much as Moore made, our rights come from our humanity. Governments are instituted by our consent, with our limitations, to protect that freedom. There was a big government crowd at Philadelphia, personified typically by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and they argued that because you need the government to protect our freedom, because the government's resources are limited, the government can decide what freedoms to protect and what freedoms to restrict. And therefore, while strictly speaking, freedoms don't come from the government, they are subject to the approval of the government. This argument, which lawyers call positivism, which basically means the law of the land is whatever the lawgiver says it is, so it was adopted by all the great nefarious dictators and monsters of the 20th century. It's even been adopted by the monsters who dominate the Congress and the executive branch today, and has been for a while. But it is exactly the opposite of the natural law. When Aquinas articulated the natural law, he said that an unjust law is no law, and that a law that violates the laws of nature, one that, for example, silenced speech because the government didn't like the speech, is a law that is not worthy of being obeyed, and that no one has an obligation of obeying an unjust law. So the argument in Philadelphia was pretty much resolved by the first 10 amendments added to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And those amendments, obviously without going through all of them, because this is about 3 or 4 weeks in the first year of law school, basically articulate rights not that the government creates or guarantees, but that the government will leave alone. Opening line of the First Amendment: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It doesn't say Congress shall grant freedom of speech. It says Congress shall not abridge the freedom of speech. The article "the" indicating an understanding by the framers that freedom of speech was something that pre-existed the country, that everybody there had, whether they were a patriot or Tory, whether they still wished that the king was here, or whether they were glad that the king was gone. Everybody had the freedom of speech. Every single word in those amendments was scrutinized in 1787, even though they weren't added until 4 years later. And that word is included in order to manifest that understanding. So your right to think as you wish, your right to develop your own personality as you wish. I've often told Bill O'Reilly he should be most grateful for that right. Your right to think as you wish, to say what you think, to publish what you say, your right to worship or not to worship, your right to keep and own a gun, which, my friends, is not the right to shoot at a deer. It's the right to shoot at the government if it is taken over by tyrants.